The night sky was quiet above the hills when the stars suddenly flickered red. The villagers had seen falling lights before, but never like this. They thought it was just another storm of burning stones until the ground shook and the air filled with strange noises. The children cried and the elders prayed as the ground split, and machines like giant insects rose from the earth. Nobody understood why they had come, but everyone felt it was the beginning of something terrible. Among the confusion, a small alien boy ran through the forest, his feet sinking into the wet soil. His breathing was heavy, but he did not stop. Behind him, voices echoed, the harsh metallic tones of soldiers that were not human. His heart pounded with fear, and his eyes filled with tears as he clutched a broken piece of cloth torn from his sister's dress. He had only one thought in his mind, and that was to find help before it was too late. Far away, in the ruins of an abandoned human base, a lone man sat sharpening his blade. The weapon was simple compared to the advanced guns that filled the galaxy, but his hands moved with calm skill. His name was unknown to many, but the few who had seen him fight whispered about him in both awe and fear. He had fought in wars no one remembered, and he had survived battles that no one believed possible. To him, the blade was not just steel. It was his promise to never run from a fight. The boy burst through the broken doorway, his small voice echoing across the stone walls. His face was pale, his eyes wide with desperation, and his hands trembled as he held out the torn cloth. The man looked up, his sharp gaze locking on the boy, and for a moment, silence filled the ruined hall. Then the boy's voice cracked as he spoke the words that would change everything. "Mighty human, my sister's been taken. Please help me save her." His plea was not just a cry. It was the spark that lit a fire inside the warrior. The man studied the boy for a long moment, then slowly placed the blade across his knees. His eyes narrowed as he considered the weight of those words. Many had asked him for help before, but few had spoken with such pure desperation. He could see the boy was not lying. The fear was too real, the grief too raw. He knew this was not just about one child. It was about the invasion that had begun, and the cruelty that would soon spread across every world if no one resisted. The machines outside roared louder, their steps like thunder as they spread through the forests and hills. Lights scanned the ground, hunting for life, and their weapons hissed with deadly energy. The boy shook as he heard them growing closer, but the man stood slowly, gripping the blade in his hand. His movements were steady, like he had been waiting for this moment for years. He had no army, no shield, and no commander to guide him. All he had was his blade, his will, and the small boy staring at him with hope. "Show me where," the man said at last, his voice calm but heavy with power. The boy's tears fell freely as he nodded, pointing toward the valley where the soldiers had dragged his sister. For the first time in hours, he felt the faint spark of hope, fragile, but alive. The mighty human stepped into the night, and the air itself seemed to shift as if the earth knew a battle was about to begin. The war had come without warning, but so had its answer. The boy ran ahead, guiding the human through the dense forest. The night air was sharp and filled with the sound of distant machines. Trees shook as searchlights swept across the ground, hunting for anything that moved. The man's eyes followed every shadow with care, but his steps were silent, his body steady like stone. To the boy, he was not just a fighter. He was hope in the form of a man who refused to fear the darkness. They came to the edge of the valley, where the machines had built their camp. Fires burned in strange metal pits, sending black smoke into the sky. The boy pointed toward a cage of glowing energy where figures huddled together. Among them was a girl with the same bright eyes as the boy, her face pale but strong. She held the hands of smaller children, whispering to them so they would not cry. The man saw her and knew at once that this was not only about saving one life. It was about breaking the chains before they spread across the world. The boy pulled on the man's sleeve, his voice a trembling whisper. "That is her. That is my sister." His hands shook, but his eyes shone with determination. The human warrior crouched low, studying the guards. They were tall and armored, their weapons glowing with blue fire. Any normal man would have turned away at the sight of such danger, but he only tightened his grip on the blade, as if the weight of the steel gave him strength. He was ready to act, even if the odds were impossible. The ground vibrated as a giant machine stomped past, its heavy steps shaking the trees. Its head turned, a beam of red light cutting through the dark. The boy pressed against the earth, his small frame shaking with fear. But the man did not move. His breath was slow, his eyes locked on the cage. He had fought worse than this before. He had seen war on planets where humans were hunted like animals. What he carried in his chest was not fear. It was defiance, burning hotter than any fire. When the machine passed, the man leaned close to the boy. His words were calm, spoken like commands carved into stone. "Stay here. Do not move until I call you." The boy wanted to argue, but the weight of the man's voice left no room for doubt. He nodded, clutching the torn cloth of his sister's dress. For the first time in his life, he believed someone could stand against the monsters. The boy's trust became a silent promise in the dark. The human stepped into the valley like a shadow. His movements were quick, yet smooth, as if the night itself bent to hide him. 2 guards patrolled near the cage, their alien armor shining under the firelight. Before they could raise their weapons, the blade flashed once. A clean strike, fast as lightning, and both fell without sound. The prisoners inside the cage gasped, their eyes wide as they saw the lone man standing over the fallen giants. To them, he looked less like a man and more like a force of nature. The girl in the cage gripped the bars, her eyes locking with his. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The man gave a single nod, and she understood he was here to free them. Hope spread through the prisoners like a wave, breaking the despair that had weighed on them for days. Even in chains, they felt strength return to their hearts. The boy's sister whispered his name, her voice trembling but alive. The war was not over, but in that moment, they knew they were no longer alone. The man stood over the fallen guards, his blade dripping with the strange blue light of their blood. The valley grew silent except for the crackle of fire and the distant march of other machines. The prisoners stared at him in shock, their chains glowing faintly in the darkness. No one had ever dared to face the invaders with nothing but a blade, yet this human stood tall, his eyes fixed on the cage as if it was the only thing in the world that mattered. He pressed the blade against the glowing lock that held the prisoners. Sparks leapt as metal hissed against alien energy. The lock resisted for a heartbeat, then shattered with a sharp crack. The barrier fell away, and the prisoners gasped as freedom opened before them. The little boy's sister stepped forward, her hands trembling as she reached toward the man. She had no words to give him, only the silent gratitude of someone who had been pulled back from despair. The children rushed out first, stumbling on weak legs. Then the older captives followed, their eyes darting to the fires and the marching shadows around the camp. They knew the silence would not last. The invaders would return soon, and their punishment would be merciless. The man lifted his hand to calm them, his gaze sharp as steel. He did not speak much, but his presence alone commanded their trust. Even in the face of terror, he carried himself as if victory was already written. The little boy ran from the trees, unable to hold back any longer. He cried out as he embraced his sister, clinging to her like he would never let go. She knelt to hold him, whispering comfort, though her own body trembled with exhaustion. For a brief moment, the human allowed them that reunion. He knew what it meant for them, and even a warrior could see the worth of such love. Yet his ears stayed alert, catching the faint sound of engines in the distance. The ground rumbled as another patrol drew closer. The glow of red lights swept through the valley, searching with deadly precision. The captives panicked, their whispers rising in fear. The man raised his blade, his eyes narrowing as he measured the approaching threat. He did not need to tell them to stay quiet. His steady stance and calm breathing spoke louder than any words. He was preparing to strike, and they felt it in their bones like the calm before a storm. Out of the shadows came 3 more soldiers, taller than the first 2 and clad in heavy armor. Their weapons hummed with a deadly rhythm, glowing brighter as they scanned the freed prisoners. One raised its weapon, but before the fire could burst, the human was already moving. His blade cut through the night, swift and precise, slicing into the weak points of their armor. The battle lasted only seconds, but it felt eternal to those watching. When it ended, the soldiers lay silent, and the man still stood. The prisoners could not believe what they had seen. The man had faced death without hesitation, and he had won. Fear turned to awe in their eyes as they looked at him, realizing he was more than flesh and blood. He was defiance given form, the kind of spirit they thought had been crushed long ago. Even the little boy's sister, who had been strong for others, found her voice caught in her throat. She could only whisper the word that now lived in all their hearts. Hope. The human wiped his blade clean, scanning the valley once more. He knew more soldiers would come, stronger and in greater numbers. This was only the beginning, not the end. He turned to the freed captives and spoke in a voice that carried like thunder. "Stay behind me. We are not running. We are fighting our way out." The children clutched each other, and the adults straightened their backs. For the first time in years, they felt they had someone to follow into the fire. The group moved quickly through the forest, their breath sharp in the cold night air. Branches snapped underfoot, and the distant glow of fires still lit the horizon. The human led the way, his blade steady at his side. Behind him, the boy clutched his sister's hand, refusing to let go for even a second. The others followed in silence, each step carrying the weight of fear, but also a spark of something new. For the first time, they were not fleeing without direction. They were following someone who walked into danger without hesitation. The invaders were not far behind. Strange calls echoed through the trees, carried by machines that never tired. Red beams of light flickered between the trunks, sweeping the ground like hunters sniffing for prey. Every shadow felt alive. Every sound felt like the last warning before death. Yet the man's stride did not falter. His calm presence cut through the panic like a blade through chains. To those behind him, his figure in the dark was more powerful than the soldiers who hunted them. At a narrow clearing, the human stopped and raised his hand. The prisoners froze, their eyes wide as they waited for his command. Ahead, a patrol of 6 soldiers moved through the trees, their armor glinting under the firelight. The human studied their pattern, watching the way they turned and the rhythm of their steps. The boy's sister held her breath, fearing they would be discovered at any moment. But the man's eyes narrowed, and his grip on the blade tightened, with deadly certainty. He moved before the soldiers even noticed him. The blade flashed once, then again, each strike swift and precise. The prisoners watched in stunned silence as he weaved through the armored giants, cutting at the joints and weak spots. Energy bursts lit the forest, scorching trees and soil, but none touched him. His body flowed like water, and his strikes landed like thunder. Within moments, the patrol was broken, their bodies collapsing with the weight of failure. The human stood among them, his breath steady, his eyes sharp as fire. The freed captives looked at one another, realizing they had witnessed the impossible. No army had ever stopped the invaders. Entire villages had been erased without resistance. Yet here was one man with a blade, striking down warriors that machines and weapons had failed to defeat. Fear in their hearts was replaced by awe, and awe slowly grew into courage. If one man could fight like this, perhaps they too could learn to resist. Perhaps their world was not doomed to chains and silence. The little boy's sister stepped forward, her voice trembling yet firm. "Why are you helping us? You do not even know us." Her words carried the question that weighed on every heart. The human glanced at her, his face calm but marked with scars of old wars. His reply was simple, spoken with the weight of truth. "Because you are alive. And if you let them take that from you, there will be nothing left worth saving." The silence that followed was heavier than any chain, but it was also freeing. The march continued, but now the prisoners walked taller. They no longer moved as frightened captives, but as survivors led by a warrior. The boy stayed close to his sister, though his eyes now carried determination instead of despair. The human's steps were steady, his senses sharp as they pressed deeper into the forest. He knew the enemy would not stop. Stronger machines would come, and the real war had yet to begin. Still, he welcomed it. For the first time in years, he had a reason to fight again. They reached a ridge where the trees parted to reveal the distant lights of a city under siege. Smoke rose into the sky, glowing red under the flames of battle. The invaders swarmed the streets, their weapons cutting down anything that moved. The human stood at the edge of the ridge, watching silently. Behind him, the boy, his sister, and the others followed his gaze with dread. The man tightened his grip on the blade, his voice low but unshaken. "This is where we turn their war into ours." The ridge overlooked the burning city, and the night was filled with fire and screams. The boy clung to his sister as smoke rose into the sky. The freed captives stood in silence, their faces pale at the sight of such destruction. The human did not speak for a long moment, his eyes locked on the chaos below. His grip on the blade tightened as though the weapon itself shared his anger. The invaders marched through the streets, their towering machines crushing walls with each step. Sparks and flames lit the ruins as beams of red light tore through homes. The prisoners could see people running, but they were few and scattered. The enemy was ruthless, leaving nothing behind but ashes. The boy's sister turned to the man, her voice breaking with grief. "How can we stand against all of that?" she asked, her words heavy with despair. The man finally spoke, his voice calm, yet unshakable. "Not by fear. Fear has already given them victory over countless worlds. But if you fight with your hearts as well as your hands, you will see they are not gods. They can be broken." His words sank into their chests, cutting deeper than the sound of explosions. Even in the face of ruin, he stood like a wall that would never fall. To the frightened, it was not just comfort, it was a command to rise. The boy's sister lifted her chin, gripping his hand tightly. She looked to the others, who watched with tired eyes but hopeful hearts. They had been prisoners for so long that they had forgotten what it felt like to resist. Now the human reminded them. He was only one man, yet he fought with a strength that shook the invaders. If he could stand against such power, then perhaps together they could reclaim more than just survival. Perhaps they could reclaim their world. The group descended the ridge carefully, staying to the shadows. The human guided them with steady steps, his ears sharp to every sound of metal and fire. He led them through broken streets and shattered buildings, always keeping them away from the main patrols. The boy's sister helped the children keep quiet, her presence calming even in the terror around them. The city smelled of ash and burned stone, yet within that ruin, the human moved like a predator in his own domain. At a ruined square, they paused as a massive machine clattered into view. Its body glowed with red lines, and its arms were lined with weapons that hissed with deadly power. The captives froze in terror, their bodies pressed against broken walls. The boy's heart raced, and he almost cried out. But then he looked at the human, who stood tall and unflinching. The man studied the machine with a steady gaze, then slowly raised his blade. The boy realized he was about to fight something that no one believed could fall. The battle came swift and violent. The machine roared, its weapons firing bursts of searing energy. The human moved with speed that defied reason, weaving between the blasts, his blade striking with precision. Sparks rained across the stones as steel met alien armor. The captives watched in awe as he leapt, cutting deep into the machine's joints, forcing it to stagger. Each strike was a promise that no force, no matter how great, could stand unchallenged forever. And when the final blow struck, the machine collapsed into ruin. The city square fell silent, broken only by the crackle of flames. The captives stepped out slowly, their eyes fixed on the man who stood above the wreck. To them, he was no longer just a warrior. He was proof that the invaders could bleed, that their power could be shattered by human will. The boy's sister whispered the truth aloud, her voice carrying through the smoke. He is not just fighting for us. He is fighting for everyone. And in that moment, even the ashes seemed to burn with new hope. The crash of the machine still echoed through the burning streets when the survivors began to move again. The human led them into the shadows of broken walls, his blade glowing faintly from the heat of battle. The boy and his sister walked close. Behind, their faces streaked with ash but shining with a strange courage. Around them, the freed captives whispered to one another in awe. They had seen the impossible, and it had changed them forever. The city was alive with danger. More patrols searched the ruins, and the ground shook with the march of armored legs. Fire painted the night sky red, and smoke stung their eyes with every breath. Yet within that chaos, the human remained calm. His eyes scanned each street, reading the movement of the enemy like a hunter tracking prey. He was not simply surviving. He was leading them through the heart of death itself. They came upon a square where dozens of prisoners were herded behind energy barriers. Alien soldiers circled them, their weapons raised, their voices harsh with command. The boy's sister gasped, recognizing faces among the captives. Families who had been taken from her village now stood trembling under the red light. The human crouched low, studying the scene. His hand brushed the blade, but his eyes held a deeper fire. To leave them behind would mean surrender. To act would mean war. The survivors looked to him, fear pulling at their voices. "We cannot save them all," one man whispered. But the human turned his gaze on him, sharp as steel. "If we choose who deserves freedom, then we are no different from them," he said. His voice carried with such weight that silence fell upon them. Even in the face of overwhelming force, he refused to bend. His words were not just an answer. They were a call to arms. The plan was swift and silent. The survivors spread along the broken walls while the human moved straight toward the guards. His steps were quiet, but his presence was thunder. The first soldier turned, weapon glowing, but the blade struck faster than light. One by one, the guards fell, their bodies collapsing before their weapons could fire. The prisoners inside the barrier stared in disbelief, their chains rattling as hope returned to their eyes. The human moved like a storm, no wall could stop. When the last guard fell, he struck at the barrier. Sparks burst in the air, and with a final cut, the field shattered. The prisoners stumbled free, their faces pale with shock and wonder. Some fell to their knees in gratitude, others clutched their children tightly. The boy's sister rushed forward, helping the weak stand and guiding them to safety. Around them, voices rose in whispers that soon grew louder. One word carried on every lip: human. The invaders answered with fury. Sirens wailed across the city, and the air filled with the roar of engines. From the burning streets came a line of soldiers twice the size of the ones before. Their armor gleamed with fresh steel, and their weapons hummed with deadly power. The freed captives trembled, and even the strongest among them felt their hope shaking. But the human stepped forward, his blade steady, his eyes fierce. He had freed too many to turn back now. He turned to the crowd, his voice carrying through fire and smoke. "Stand with me, do not run. They think you are broken. Show them you are not." His words struck deep, and slowly men and women rose beside him. They picked up fallen weapons, broken tools, even stones from the ruins. Fear still clung to them, but behind it burned a flame that had been lit anew. For the first time, they did not see themselves as prisoners. They saw themselves as fighters. The soldiers advanced in perfect formation, their armor shining with crimson light. The ground shook beneath their march, and the air filled with the hiss of their weapons. The freed captives trembled at the sight, but the human stood calm at the front. His blade rested at his side, ready for war. Behind him, the boy held his sister's hand tightly, his small chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. Everyone knew the next moments would decide more than survival. They would decide whether hope could truly stand against fear. The first shots tore through the night, beams of energy slicing across the square. Walls shattered, and flames leapt higher, sending sparks into the sky. Yet the human moved like a shadow, his body weaving between blasts. His blade cut through the air, deflecting strikes and breaking weapons with precise force. Around him, the freed captives rose with shouts of defiance, hurling stones, swinging metal rods, and charging with courage born from desperation. The clash was not balanced, but it was fierce. The boy's sister grabbed a fallen weapon, her hands shaking as she fired at the enemy. The beam struck one soldier, piercing its chest with a crack of light. She gasped at what she had done, but then her fear turned to fire. Others followed her example, lifting weapons from the ground and striking with all their strength. For the first time, the invaders staggered under the combined resistance of those they once thought weak. The humans' leadership had turned fear into fury. The enemy pressed harder, their discipline unbroken. More machines rolled into the streets, their cannons burning holes through stone. The prisoners scattered for cover, but they did not break. The human leapt onto one machine, his blade driving deep into its glowing joints. Sparks burst in every direction as he tore through the armor, his movements sharp and unrelenting. With a final strike, the machine collapsed, flames spilling from its frame. A roar rose from the captives as they saw the impossible fall once again, but victory came at a cost. Several fighters lay wounded, their cries piercing through the chaos. The boy's sister rushed to their side, pulling them away from the heat of battle. She looked at the human, her eyes full of both fear and determination. "We cannot hold them forever," she shouted. The man met her gaze with calm steel. "Then we strike harder," he answered. His words were not loud, but they carried strength, enough to silence despair. The boy watched everything with wide eyes, his small fists clenched. He had once believed he was powerless, but now he saw the truth. Even a child could carry courage when others stood beside him. He picked up a broken piece of metal and stood at his sister's side, ready to defend her. His small act was seen by others, and it spread like fire. Even the weakest among them found something to hold, something to use, and together they formed a line that would not bend. The battle raged until the streets glowed with fire. Bodies of soldiers and broken machines littered the ground. The human stood at the center, his chest heaving but his eyes unbroken. Around him the captives had become fighters, their fear burned away by the heat of defiance. Though blood and ash covered them, their spirits shone brighter than the flames around them. They had proven something tonight that could never be taken back. The invaders were not untouchable. They could fall. As the last wave of soldiers withdrew, the survivors gathered in the broken square. Their bodies were tired, but their eyes carried a fierce light. The human raised his blade high, the fire reflecting along its edge. "This is not the end," he said, his voice ringing across the ruins. "This is the beginning. We will fight. We will rise, and we will take back everything they tried to steal." His words struck every heart, binding them together with a single truth. The war was no longer theirs alone. It belonged to humanity. The dawn rose over the ruined city, painting the smoke-stained sky with pale light. Fires still burned in the distance, but the night of battle had ended. The human stood at the front of the survivors, his blade resting against the ground. His body bore cuts and burns, yet his eyes were steady and unbroken. Behind him, the boy, his sister, and the freed captives gathered, their faces weary but proud. They had survived the storm, and now they stood together in its aftermath. The streets were littered with the wreckage of machines and the bodies of soldiers. The air carried the heavy silence of a battlefield that had claimed too many lives. The boy's sister held his hand tightly, her gaze sweeping over the ruins. She knew this was not the end of the war, only the first step in something far greater. But in her heart, she felt a strength she had never known before. They were no longer prisoners. They were fighters who had proven their worth in fire. The human turned to face them, his voice firm but calm. "You have seen what they are. You have seen what you can become. This fight will not be easy. They will come with greater force, with armies that stretch beyond the horizon. But if you hold on to this fire, if you refuse to bow, they cannot break you." His words cut through the silence like steel, and every eye turned to him with unshakable trust. He had earned not only their respect but their loyalty. The boy stepped forward, his small voice rising in the still air. "We will not run again, not as long as you stand with us." His words carried more power than his size suggested, and the survivors nodded in agreement. Even the oldest among them felt their spirits rise at the sight of a child speaking with such courage. The human placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, his expression unreadable but his touch steady. It was a silent promise that he would not abandon them. Together they began to move through the streets, gathering more survivors hidden among the ruins. The human led them with purpose, guiding them toward the hills beyond the city. Along the way, they armed themselves with weapons from fallen soldiers and pieces of broken machines. What had once been a group of prisoners was becoming something greater. They were no longer scattered and afraid. They were a force bound by survival, by hope, and by the will to resist. When they reached the hills, the city burned behind them like a warning to the galaxy. The boy's sister stood beside the human, watching the smoke rise into the sky. "They will come again," she said, her voice steady despite her fear. The man nodded, his eyes on the horizon where the enemy would return. "Yes, and when they do, we will be ready." His tone carried no doubt, no hesitation. To him, this war was already decided. The only path left was forward. The survivors began building shelters among the rocks, turning their fear into work. The children fetched water, the adults set up watchpoints, and the wounded were tended with care. Every action carried purpose, driven by the memory of the battle they had won together. The boy moved among them with his sister, helping where he could, his heart swelling with pride. He no longer felt like a helpless child. He felt like part of something that mattered. He felt like part of a future worth fighting for. As the sun climbed higher, the human stood alone for a moment, his blade resting across his shoulders. He looked toward the stars, knowing the true war had only begun. Yet he also knew he was no longer fighting alone. The boy's voice echoed in his mind, the plea that had started it all. "Mighty human, please help me save her." That single call had grown into something unstoppable. And now, with a new army rising behind him, he was ready to lead them into the war that would shape the fate of their world.